Welcome everyone and Happy New Year. Today we are excited to bring you the first ever episode of our 101 Ways podcast. So why did we decide to launch a new podcast? We wanted to give something back to our customers and to the wider tech community. We've worked on some really exciting projects over the last 10 years and also have a very talented team of consultants and lots of knowledge and experience. So we thought we'd share it with you. As our name suggests, there are 101 ways to solve a problem. It's about having the correct skills and expertise in place to find the right way forward that works for you. So we hope our podcast will go some way to helping you do just that. You can listen, download and follow us on Spotify and also watch and subscribe on our YouTube channel. I'm going to be your host for the next few episodes. My name's Emma Hopkinson-Spark. I'm Chief of Staff and I lead the knowledge and practice area of 101 Ways. And to kick us off on our first podcast episode, I'm joined by Grant Smith. Grant, do you want to give an introduction to yourself too?
Yeah, sure. Hi. So I'm Technical Director at 101 Ways. I lead our software engineering practice.
Awesome, thank you. So the first thing we're going to be talking about then on this episode 1 is all about modernisation. It's one of those words that gets thrown around all the time and you see it all over LinkedIn and all over your socials and stuff. But what do we actually mean by that? We talk about modernising your tech or how you do it or what it means. So really we wanted to kick off with just that actually. What is it? So question 1 then, what do we mean by it?
So when we talk about modernisation at 101 Ways and whenever you search for things like modern development practices on Google, that kind of stuff, the concept is that in the last 10 years, technology has evolved to higher and higher level capabilities to the point now where something that used to take 2 years can now be done in 3 or 4 months by the same size team because we have much more sophisticated tools. Those tools have become more specialized. So if you take the most basic example, 10 years ago, if you were building a website, maybe you'd be using JavaScript, but you're just using the JavaScript language. There's not much out there to help you. Now, if you're building a website, you'd probably build it in TypeScript. There's an entire tool chain of separate tools to help you format it, help you optimize it. You've got React to help you structure it, help you do server-side rendering, those kinds of things. So the idea behind modernization is by embracing some tools, I say new tools, I'm talking about tools that have been developed in the last 10 years, but by embracing that tool set, the tool chain, and by embracing modern ways of working, you can do a lot more with smaller teams, a lot faster than you were ever able to do 10 years ago.
I might just show my age here, but 10 years feels like nothing. It's like 10 years ago was a blink of an eye. We really need to modernize from just 10 years ago. How quickly is that kind of the evolution and that turnover of technology there?
It's quite interesting because the advancement of technology over the last 10 years hasn't been homogeneous. It's not across the whole breadth of technology. We've definitely seen huge advances in data technology. I know you're a former DBA, so you're probably aware of that stuff. You know, the big data movement has largely been this last 10 years with Hadoop and, Snowflake and Databricks being the kind of latest players in that field. Similarly, on the front end, React, I think it's either 10 or 8 years old, but it's around that kind of time scale. React came along and basically gave a huge amount of structure to help people build websites faster. It comes with some costs, but it does accelerate those kinds of things. But not just with React. As I said, there's this whole tool chain of capabilities that enable teams to go faster and faster and faster. What's interesting is that in the sort of back-end side of it, traditional kind of application development, there hasn't been as much evolution there. There's some, it's not zero, but it's not like in the same scale. If you were building a Java app 10 years ago and you come to it now, yeah, there's some differences, but it would be very familiar and you kind of pick it up in a few weeks. If you were a vanilla JavaScript developer from 10 years ago and I introduced you to a modern TypeScript project, there'd be a learning curve. It's not massive, but you'd be a few weeks before you were comfortable with all this stuff. So there's been significant development in the things that we all do lots of. And if you think about how the application landscape has changed the last 10 years, think about Airbnb, think about Facebook. I know that's kind of slightly older than 10 years now, it's nearly 20 years. But, if you look at those kind of Uber and those sorts of things, everybody was out there with websites and mobile apps that needed to deliver really fast, really direct experiences. So people knew they were getting a cab or they knew that their food delivery was going to arrive. And so a lot of that development has been about technologies that really engage the customers, work well for SEO, and give the kind of user experience that means that customer comes back and back and back, right? It's not optional anymore, right? These are now the primary sales channels. And so that's where most of this development has been happening.
Right. And has it changed so much? I mean, I'm I say showing my age, 10, 15 years ago. So it was very different, and customers were wanting a different experience and wanting more. Has it really changed that much in the last 10 years about what people are after and what they're trying to build? Or is it just the how we do it that's changed?
A little bit of both. So there's an old bit of adage, and I think this comes up when you use the Google development tools, which tells you some story about how Walmart or somebody saved, 1 second off their page load times and they made millions of dollars, that kind of stuff, right? So everyone's heard those stories a million times now. What's become obvious is there's a lot of businesses out there that thrive on SEO, right? They rely on people using Google searches to find their businesses, that kind of stuff, like Zoopla, who we worked with, right? And because the market is... it's very easy to launch a new site, right? So everyone's fighting to be that top search result or the second search result, that kind of stuff. So there's not as much room for error as there used to be, right? There's a lot of players, people are optimizing. The competition for attention is more than ever. I mean, how many apps are available in the App Store, right? I mean, the competition for your attention is everywhere. And so what has changed, I think, is customers expect instantaneous results, much more so than they ever have before. You are old enough to remember the first 3G type services. Compare that to a modern 5G service, right? It's a very different experience. So yes, there is a customer expectation that goes with it, but there's also a company expectation. If you show off your new website to your CEO and it waits 3 seconds to load, he's going to have questions, right? So there is just this overall societal expectation. We want this stuff faster. We need to compete for that SEO position. There's a lot of, because there's been so much change, in a lot of industries, you can rely on kind of, what would I call it, historical knowledge. You learn this stuff over 10 years. Google, potentially, in some years, they change the SEO criteria sometimes every 6 months, which means what was true 2 years ago may be completely irrelevant now. And yet you'll still potentially have people who are taking that knowledge forward, like, oh no, this is absolutely essential. And it just isn't something that Google care about anymore. So there's a lot of... I guess mysticism around some of this stuff because it isn't necessarily easily understood and because it changes so frequently. So there is that customer expectation, company expectation of what they expect from this stuff. But the second part of your question was, or is it just how we develop it? That's changed massively too, because if you think about it, again, 10 plus years ago, everyone needs a website. Everyone's website has certain components. You've got buttons, you've got links, you've got tables, you've got images, you've got carousels, you've got all these different components. A lot of people got fed up with just building the same stuff again and again and again. So what developers did was they said, no, let's pull together a component library. So you get things like material UI and that kind of stuff. And everyone was developing CSS. So people built things like Tailwind, stuff like that. So they didn't have to care so much about the CSS stuff. So what's happened is we're taking advantage of various open source projects, advances made by certain companies who have contributed to those open source, and just made it simpler and faster for us to achieve the same results. So I think it's an element of, yes, customer expectations have changed, company expectations have changed, given these are their primary sales channels now, but also then developer expectations have changed too. And that's another piece to this, which is we're all competing for engineers. I remember a report came out, I think it would have been about 2004-ish or something when I was at AOL. I think it was a Gartner thing or something that talked about how, in 10 years' time, there'll be a massive shortage of developers. We've all lived through that, right? It's very hard to hire the engineers you want, particularly the caliber you're looking for. And engineers these days are looking for good modern environments to come work on, right? They don't want to be working on 10-year-old languages. They don't want to be working on platforms where they've got to hand code a button again from scratch when they know there's a component library out there they can just pull this thing from. So there's also that element too. It isn't just what the customers are looking for, what the companies are looking for, and how we develop. It's also what developers are looking for in terms of as a compelling organization for them to come work for.
One of the things that really strikes me, I guess, is that it's never going to be a one hit and done. 10 years ago, people thought that they were modern, and they were. And then here we are talking about 10 years is nothing. I've got socks older than that. And yet we're still we're still talking about how you have to go and modernize that. Is the rate changing as well, though? As in 10 years' time, we will be saying, oh, remember we wrote this code 10 years ago and everyone was using TypeScript. Now look at it. Or is it in 5 years' time? Is it in 2 years' time? Does it become, is it accelerating? What's that kind of rate of renewal, do you think, on some of these issues?
I think it's not linear. I think it goes in kind of humps, right? So when React first came out, we saw a lot of development in that space. And you probably remember us all joking about the JavaScript engine wars, right? It was it Vue or was it Svelte? Was it React? And React seems to be a clear winner. There's still room for those other frameworks, by the way, but React is a clear winner in that space. What I would say is, I believe I've seen something like, I can't remember what it's properly called, but it's something like the technology adoption curve looks like the grief curve, right? It goes through stages and cycles and stuff. And clearly we're all in the kind of generative AI world right now. That's kind of the hot topic. So what I'm seeing is, I'm seeing a slight slowdown in the development of what's going on in the front end. React has been around a while. I'm not seeing anything obvious that might kick it off its perch, but there are some technologies that are being discussed. The way I talk about this stuff is, the way most companies invest in their technology is an innovate and exploit cycle. Right? I didn't come up with that. Somebody cleverer than me did. But there's an element where you have investment money, you innovate, i.e. you build the thing, you get it ready, and then you intend to exploit that for a period of time where you don't intend to continue expending on innovation. And so it has a lifespan, and then it's time to innovate, right? And there is a sort of natural cycle for these things. I say natural, I mean natural for the company involved, depending on their business model, what they go after. There are a very small number of companies I've found where they try to smooth that out and try to continually innovate. That's a tricky thing to do in a world where you have to show returns to investors and they have to reap the rewards of that for some time before you can liberate the next phase of investment. So I think that, as I say, that boom and bust cycle or innovate and exploit cycle is sort of natural depending on how companies are funded, what their shareholders expect of them, that kind of thing. And if they get purchased or become part of a group or something else. So what I would say is we're not seeing so much development at the moment in pure front-end tech. A lot of the focus at the moment is on how Gen AI can help accelerate us, and there are some things it can do to help accelerate building kind of front-end tech. But modernization isn't just front-end stuff, right? Modernization also applies to the cloud. So we all remember when the cloud came in, sort of my first involvement was sort of 2009-ish, and we were basically building servers, but in the cloud. These days you have a whole wealth of options, serverless options, more native options. And so in the front end space, given we were kind of talking about that, the key now is, where do you deploy that to? We don't build web servers like we used to. We deploy onto some of those front-end services like AWS Amplify or Netlify or Vercel or those sorts of things. That tends to be where we do, because those are front-ends that are optimized for that kind of serving. Likewise, if we're building back-end services, we don't just go stand up a server and go build on it. We might do that. That might be the right use case, but also we might use a messaging or an events platform, or we might use a kind of serverless thing if we're just building something, lightweight and stateless, that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of options we have to choose. So that modernization, this modernization approach is this idea of using modern solutions. You choose what's right for you and your particular use case. Now, that's not to say everyone's got to be on serverless, but there are definitely some things that make way more sense in serverless than not. There's also some things that just don't make sense in serverless. So you need to be smart to choose where to go. That's kind of where we come in, right? Is having that sense of what works well, what doesn't in different scenarios. So what I would say at the moment is, the development we're seeing is developers and all software engineers in general are starting to get the hang of the fact that their role is as much about system design almost as it is about software design, and that they need to be equally skilled in both. And that is, again, part of modernization, is knowing when to use a system. When should I use an event system as opposed to maybe a message bus, or as opposed to just writing some software in a server or what have you. So it's about almost that whole gamut of how you deliver a service to a customer.
Who do you think should be thinking about this stuff then? Because a lot of the examples that you just gave then, I could see as the developer that sat there figuring stuff out, or a tech lead or whoever it may be that's trying to solve those problems. But actually, what role does someone like a CTO or an engineering director, how did they decide we're at a point, we're in that cycle, we're at that point where actually now is the time to invest? Because, an average developer in a team is never going to be the person that gets to make that decision, or they're the ones that's crying out for it and highlighting some of those issues. But how does it come about, do you think, that a business is ready then to make that decision and to make that investment?
This is surprisingly simple. You could either get a small change out in a week, or you can't. there's a point, and this is one of those trust me bro things, as in I've been in the industry a long time. There's a point where your tech stack gets in your way, and through, whether it's because it's old fashioned, whether it's because there's better ways of doing it or whatever, something that you look at as a CTO or a head of engineering and you say, it should take somebody a couple of days, right? Should be out in a week, no problem. And suddenly it's been dragging on for 3 weeks. There's some friction in your system somewhere. And it may not be system, it may not be modernization requirement, but it probably is. It's probably that your pipeline is old and out of date. Maybe your test pyramid's got too top heavy and you've got too many end-to-end tests. And that's when it's worth starting to think about, okay, how do I do test automation? There's another aspect of kind of modernization, right? It's an automated pipeline. So the simple answer is, if as a CTO or a head of engineering or even a CPO or a head of product or whatever, and you're looking at this stuff and you're going, I know this kind of capability should be built in a week. Why is it taking so long? What's the hold up? That's your first red flag of, maybe there's something in this stack needs modernizing. Maybe there's something out of date here. Maybe I'm still deploying onto servers and it takes Amazon like 3 minutes to stand one up, where maybe I should be deploying to a service where it's almost instantaneous, that kind of thing. So yeah, that's what it comes down to. The when is something's taking longer than it should do. And if you're seeing that a couple of times, that's when I think it's worth having a look and saying, what's out of kilter here? What's taking so long? And obviously, as you said, the developers probably know. I've never worked anywhere where the developers didn't know what was getting in their way, right? They're not so great at articulating it all the time. Sometimes they need some help with that. But that's the point. You get in there and you start saying to these people, okay, what's the hold up? What's the problem? How's this work? And inevitably, being developers, they'll tell you what the solution is, which isn't telling you what the problem is, right? So again, that's where the skill comes in, of extract that problem from them, and then you can figure out, okay, what is in here that needs modernizing. But the first port of call is always, it's taking longer than it should. And that's very much an instinct thing. Every head of engineering and CTO has that kind of concept of, I know that should only take a couple of days. What's the hold?
Yeah, I don't think I've ever met the developer that hasn't joined somewhere and immediately said, we have to rebuild this from scratch. Like, it's not going to work. We have to rebuild it, to the point where it's like, yeah, okay. And like, nobody else to do.
And you're right. And there was definitely a phase, I don't even know when, years back, where you would say, that's always the wrong answer. Yeah. Like, there was a time when, 9 times out of 10, that's the wrong answer and the answer's somewhere else. And this is kind of the point of this modernization piece we're talking, though, because what I'm saying here now is, actually, they might be right? And I know it's potentially counterintuitive, particularly if you come from those times of, no, I'm not rewriting a 1 million line Java app again. Let's look at a better solution. But my point here is that 10 years ago, what might have been a 1 million line Java app might be a combination of a couple of serverless processes and an event system, and a cloud native data store or something, just because there are these much more advanced capabilities that you can just kind of pull out from the cloud. And code is burden. Every line of code is a burden, right? Every line of code's got to go through a testing cycle. Every line of code is subject to, some concern, right? Even if you haven't changed it, some circumstance on the internet could have changed, and now you have to care about that code again that you've not had to look at. The log stash mess that we had, a couple of years ago, that was nobody's fault. It had a vulnerability, and suddenly we've got to change a bunch of things, right? So it's one of those things where actually I would encourage any CTO or head of engineering I always look at to say, actually, should this just be rewritten? Is this one of those times where using modern tools, modern tech, I can write less code, achieve the same result by using more advanced services?
And do you think that's really the case? I mean, I know some of the clients and stuff that we've worked with and that you've worked really closely in the past, that is that what we've done? Is that what happened? So I am from that era of like, yeah, of course you need to rewrite it. We've spent 5 years writing this in the first place. Like, I can show you numerous articles that say that's never the right way to do it, and let's just keep improving it instead. So that is always in the back of my head. But tell me when that has been the case then, and how. Yeah.
I'll give you a very specific example just because it's quite small and it sort of highlights this. So one of the clients we were working with before we had modernized their stack had a vanilla JavaScript stack. They started it, I've now got to work backwards, maybe 11 years ago. So they were kind of ahead of the curve, embracing JavaScript early, doing all the right things. But they weren't using some of the modern frameworks. And a particular engineer, one of our consultants, a really good developer, had to code a button and put an A/B test on it, right? So the button did 2 different things depending on what sample group you were in. because it was vanilla JavaScript and he had to code everything himself, so there was no usable component library, and because the experimentation tool they were using was also custom built, that was a 2-week task for a great developer. This is one of the best we've got, right? So great developer, 2-week task, build a button, put an A/B test on it. Different client, but also a modernization example. We had built a React platform. We had implemented Optimizely as the experimentation engine. And again, one of our engineers showed that they could build an experiment in 40 minutes.
Wow. So
2 weeks, handcrafting, hand coding everything, 40 minutes by using modern tools and techniques. Now, I'm kind of quoting that because if you think about the developer cost, particularly, of a consultant developer, right? 2 weeks to achieve something fairly standard versus 40 minutes. That's the kind of thing. Now, not every single change is of that order of magnitude, but it gives you this idea. The other thing I would add is that not only are these tools more advanced, but there's more people working on them. So if you can go Google what's the most popular language, what's the most popular framework, all that kind of stuff, and you get these percentage numbers. If you think about all of those engineers that are working on the most popular modern tech, right, React, which is 10 years old already almost, the number of solutions that are available on Stack Overflow, the help you can get from ChatGPT or Code Whisperer or Copilot or any of those kinds of things is vastly more sophisticated, because if you think about what's been going on in the last 4 or 5 years, how many people are still contributing to Perl or PHP for those kinds of use cases, right? So even from that perspective, if you think about an engineer trying to solve a problem and getting help from the internet, they can get much more high value help for more modern technology. So I'm not trying to say it's always the right thing to rebuild your app from scratch. I'm definitely not making that point. But I am saying if you're in a position where your changes are taking more than a couple of weeks to get out the door regularly, even for simple things, that's the point to start having a think.
There's a couple of things I want to drill into it. I think the first one, so one of the questions that get asked a lot in lots of like the community groups and stuff that we're involved in is what kind of metrics should we be looking at? How do we know if we're performing well? Yeah. And time and time again, people go to DORA metrics. Now, the one that you're calling out there is how long does it take you to get something at the door? Do you think is that the one you call out because it's the one thing that you think you should be guided by? Are the others relevant at all in that kind of balance? And when you're thinking of it, how do the rest of those really fit into that?
So I only call that one out because usually most organizations are quite fixated on the next feature, right? So that's why I call that one out. Why is my feature taking so long? There's your metric, right? There's your thing. There's your red flag. I'm actually a huge fan of the DORA metrics. The DORA metrics are genius because we always talk about be careful what you measure, you get what you measure, that kind of stuff. The DORA metrics have been set up very cleverly that even if you try to game them, even if you try to take the mickey royally, you achieve a good result. So the DORA metrics are genius. The fifth one, I call it the fifth unofficial DORA metric. I always use it as well, which is time to onboard new engineers. Right. So again, here's your key point. If you've got an old stack, lots of custom stuff that you've been building for 10 years, it probably takes you 2 weeks, 3 weeks before an engineer is committing something useful. We have a goal when we do modernization that's 1 day. And I don't mean 1 day just to update some variable in a text file and move it. I mean to actually pick up a ticket and go do something because they know React, maybe they know Next.js, they know AWS, whatever the hell it's running on. And so they're able to do something useful and be able to contribute well in a day. So the other DORA metrics are useful. So again, if we think about, I can't remember all of them off the top of my head, but mean time to failure, right? So in the scenarios we have right now, we have our code in a source repository. We know exactly what version is where. We know what just went live. And it's very easy for us to deploy the last good version. Right, so we don't have to work backwards. We don't have to fix forwards. We can just go, let's deploy the last good version. With modern tech solutions, if you look at deploying to things like AWS Amplify and Vercel for your front-end stack, they actually keep the last cached version. So that roll forward to the last good version is instantaneous. Mm-hmm. It's not even a second, right? It's just there already, right? If you look at things like even just deploying a traditional server, let's say there is a reason for you to have a big fat Java server that's running, really big complicated algorithms. Well, we deploy in containers these days, right? Containers are aware of the layers that have changed in them. So when you do a deploy, that deploy isn't deploying, your 300 megs of server. it's deploying just the pieces that have changed. So that change is instant, right? So again, by modernizing and going on to sort of more modern solutions, you get the benefits of cheats almost that get you those DORA metrics lower and lower and lower. So I'm a big fan of all of the DORA metrics. I think they all provide a value and they work in concert with each other, right? Each one affects the others, or at least affects one of the others. And then if you add in that time to onboard a new developer, you get this sense of, well, how much time are you wasting? Like I said, we've had clients where it has been 2 to 3 weeks simply because their tech stack isn't just old. Old isn't the worst thing, right? Most people who could do TypeScript and React know JavaScript, but it's also how much custom work is required to make that stuff really useful. Whereas, again, with modern tech stacks, less custom work is needed because we're using more kind of off-the-shelf type capability and just trying to use it in more interesting ways.
The other thing that really led to me thinking is, and this is maybe more of a controversial subject to get into, so we love those, is how does someone know what they don't know? And think of like CTO and engineering leader, so somebody that's involved in making these decisions in an organization. That was maybe, how many startups do we know where they were the first engineer 10, 15 years ago and they wrote it, and now they're the CTO and they've got teams working for them. How do they know that it's time to do something different? Do they say like how long it takes? Say the example of the 2 weeks to do a button. Maybe they just think that that's how long it takes to do that. So they don't know that there's a bad smell about that or that it could be better. It's really difficult, I think, for some people that are especially emotionally invested and time invested right on 10, 15 years ago to say, actually, screw up what we've done. It's time to do something new. Or there's things I don't know. There's people around me that are new into the org and probably know more or are ready to bring in new skills and new knowledge. That's difficult, I think, for some people to face into.
It is. And particularly your example was really valid because we've encountered this a few times where the CTO last coded in 2005 because they've been in leadership roles since then. How do they know what good looks like and things? And I think there's a couple of things. Every company I've ever come into, either as a consultant or, as a sort of permanent member of the team, the company has known things aren't right. There's a vibe, to talk how the kids say. There's a sense that this is not happening as fast as we think it should, or there are more incidents than there should be, or we're struggling to hire people, right? There's a lot of flags out there that can go amber or red that give you a warning sign that stuff isn't right. And as I said to you, the developers always know. The tricky part is getting that information out of them in a way that gives you, really useful advice you can take, right? One of the clients where we ended up doing a modernization project, like that wasn't our initial brief, right? It became obvious that became the right thing to do and we worked with them on it. The red flag was hiring. They just couldn't get the people in they wanted. They were just struggling to get the right people. And they knew that tech stack was old. So the hard part was, well, we know it's old. We know we should do something new, but we're scared because that's a big thing, right? It took us 10 years to get here. How are we going to replicate this capability in 10 years? Now, in that particular company, 101 Ways worked alongside the engineers at the client. So it was a combined team of 101 Ways and client engineers trying to get them to the next stage. We essentially built equivalent capability in 9 months. So that wasn't us doing it our fastest. That was us also working with teams and upskilling them and helping grow that capability and even helping them hire new engineers as well. So we were able to do that, the replication of that capability in a very short amount of time because modern tools and technologies. So your question is, how do you know? How do you know it's possible or how do you know it's there? Well, one of the other things that goes along with this sort of more modern approach to tech is there are infinite sources of information out there in terms of blog sites, YouTube videos, all that kind of stuff. So one thing I would say is if you just do a Google search for blog modern development practices, literally the whole page full of good stuff. I think there was one, answer that wasn't very useful. And it talks about those articles talk about this in broken down terms. So it will talk about how you build the applications versus how you deploy them versus how you monitor them versus what next, that kind of stuff. There's, we were talking a bit earlier about some of modernization is about system design, not software design. There's a great guy on YouTube called Gaurav Sen who has a whole sort of series of videos that are about system design, where he talks about this from the perspective of, you are trying to solve this problem. The code you have might look like this, but here's a system solution that would also work and is less code, that kind of stuff. So the stuff's out there. The tricky part has always been for CTOs and heads of engineering is, when do they get the time to do that research? When do they get the time to know and to find out and to reach out to those communities? And the only thing I can say to that is, I know that's tough, but I also know being buried in 40 hours of meetings a week is not the right way to lead a team. So I think there's an onus on those people to get that time to break themselves out of this. And the other thing I would say is, this kind of what consultancies do, right? If you want to have a conversation about, what's the latest in, event platforms and how would you do it? Or, I've got some data, I'm interested in seeing what I can get out of it from a machine learning perspective. Are there faster ways than spending 2 years building a data lake? Yeah, those conversations are going to be had there. So I think it's one of those things where there are free communities, there's LinkedIn, there's reaching out to consultants to do assessments and that kind of work. And frankly, the information is everywhere. So the trick is finding the time and doing a search. But if you did a search for something like, how long should it take to code a button on a website? I bet there's an answer out there.
I think we can come back to as well, like you say, the engineers in your team probably know as well, right? So, as the leader, you may not have the time to stay up to date with everything, but you can be sure that there are engineers in your team that are still researching stuff at night and coding for fun and wanting to do things in a different way. So you can start by talking to your team as well, really.
Absolutely. Yeah, as we said, I've never been in any company where the answer didn't exist inside the company, and that part of my job was to pull that out in a consumable fashion. And I remember the first time I ever worked with a consultant when I was much younger, I had that view of, they're only telling us stuff we already know. But it's about trying to structure that in such a way that someone can action that, right? Rather than a developer just go, we should build this in this rather than that. It's a matter of, here's the problems, these are the costs, this is what that looks like, here's how you could do this for the cheapest or fastest or most efficient or whatever kind of, driver or motivator you have. So it's one of those difficult ones where, particularly with the latest stuff with generative AI, it's never been easier to get an answer. The trick is knowing what the question is.
Yeah. I want to talk about something else as well, which is, I guess, I feel like we're making it sound very easy, and it's a bit of a no-brainer of like, of course you shouldn't modernize. Why would you not stay up to date? Look how much greater it can be when you've done it. But we've also, I'm sure you have been involved with many companies where you take one look at like under the bonnet about what's going on, and it's less Frankenstein's monster of half done technologies and then rebuild over here and something else that was never finished over here and all bolted together into a bit of a mess. Now that happens, right? If people start stuff, don't finish it. But so where does it go wrong? How can people avoid it? What's the risks and the dangers, I guess, of kicking off something of a modernization project?
Yeah, good shout. I think part of the problem with the tech stacks we were using sort of 10 or so years ago was that it required us to write a lot of code. We needed a lot of stuff to make things happen. And so when you have a lot of stuff, you're tempted to do things like set up dependencies. I've already got a piece of code that does this. I'll reuse that elsewhere in my application. That then means that piece of code is now being used by 27 other pieces of code. Yes, well done, you made it faster, but when it's time to change that piece of code, you've now got to make sure 27 other things work at the same time. One of the things about taking a more modern approach is that we build things in much more modular ways, and we actively work against those sorts of dependencies. If we need a dependency like that, we'll either build it as a separate library, which was perfectly possible 10 years ago too, by the way, or we'll build it as a separate service. I gave an example earlier, an event platform, right? If I need to move messages between services, I don't code the same thing into each service. I build in a platform and they all shout at it and they all subscribe to each other's topics and stuff. So I get that kind of break of the dependency. So I think the risk of building spaghetti applications where everything's all messed up, or the risk of building things that eventually become sluggish, is much lower now. Of course, it's always possible. You can always screw things up if you try hard enough. But one of the things that has been going on in the last 10 years is trying to make it harder and harder to make that difficult. That's what's been there. It's been recognized that is one of the challenges. almost every young engineer has a story of how they had to touch the bit of code that no one's touched in 5 years, and how difficult that was and how horrifying it was. So we've built things to try and avoid doing that. So I think the chances of doing it in an existing organization, in an organization that's modernizing, it's less likely you're going to do that. Still requires care. There's still attention needed, but it's less likely to do it. To the other side of that question, which is, you've lifted up the hood and you found there is this difficult to deal with thing. Well, we've also got some solutions for that in that kind of modernization toolkit. A great example of that is GraphQL. So GraphQL can do lots of interesting things, but one of the things it can do is it can act as an intermediary service between your APIs and your front end. So one of the challenges for all the tech stacks is the API will have been built to deliver the information in a certain way, but as the front end is modernized, it needs to present that in different ways. You don't want to code that into your front end because that takes time to render and reformat it, which you don't want to have your users. GraphQL can act as a server to go and reformat that data and optimize it for display at the front end. Now, you just added complexity, right? Because I just put a new service in place. But the trick to this is you can't destroy complexity in engineering. I don't think. You can only move it to places where it becomes more manageable. So if instead of having to change each of those APIs at the back end, I have one place to kind of structure a graph of data that my front end can use, yes, I've added a bit of complexity, but I've also made it much easier to make changes in the way I want. Now, a lot of back-end engineers will argue, well, you're solving the wrong problem. You should solve it at the API layer. I agree, but a lot of companies struggle to do that. So this is where what we can do is we can look at an existing system. Let's say you've got an old school monolith or something like that. We can take a look at what are the inputs and outputs. Can I piggyback off those inputs? So if there's an API gateway and it's bringing something in, can I split that traffic off to my new system and have it process in parallel to see when I'm ready for the new system to overtake it? Do I take the hit and build in something like a modern event system into my monolith so it's shouting about the things it's doing so I can build a new system to hang off of that? So there's a lot of tools we can use, and maybe they require a bit of upfront unpleasant work you don't like, but it then frees you up to move faster using sort of modern tech. So I won't lie to you, that's not trivial, right? That's some of the hardest code you can do. But it's one of those things that once you've done it, once you're over that hurdle and you've got that data out of that monolithic system and into a more modern system, you can then start moving quickly. And one of the patterns I've seen recently is this idea that we don't work to necessarily get rid of the monolith because there's a level of work there that most people aren't willing to do. What you do is you kind of decompose that until it's doing less and less and less, until the things it's doing are relatively low value. You still need them, but they're not where the business is making its revenue and stuff. So it's okay. It lives there. It's kind of encapsulated. You have some specialists that look after it, but all of your new business, all of the things that are most valuable to you are being done in a more modern stack that's kind of hived away from that monolith. So one thing I often will say to CTOs and boards and things is that when you're considering that you want to change something in your tech stack, first of all, don't assume that the old one just disappears one day. I think that's relatively unrealistic, particularly for larger, more mature organizations. More, assume that your job is to minimize the risk it places on your business. And likewise, how much you spend on modernizing should be an investment case. In other words, you'll spend an amount of money, you'll take it a particular effort, you'll have an opportunity cost because those engineers are not doing something else, and you're buying a solution for a period of time. So don't assume this thing's forever. If you're a small business and you spend £1 million on a particular thing, what's it giving you back? Now, if it gives you back 5 million in revenue, gold, you're making profit. That's wonderful, right? So it's what I think that's the key issue here is it's not about, change everything, rewrite everything. It's more about our business has to solve a specific problem, right? We're either going for a new product or our product has to modernize or change somehow. Doing it in the existing system has proven impossible or impractical based on time. How could we do that with a new approach? And what would that buy us? What would that get us? And if that does liberate more revenue, does that then allow me to further reduce risk in that older stack, that monolith or whatever that other tech stack is? So it's a much more nuanced game than just rewrite everything or, build a new thing and switch off the old thing. It's more interesting to have a look at this from the perspective of, I have a problem, I need to solve it, I've got fixed budget, fixed time. So the solution that has to change, the scope has to change, how I do it has to change. Maybe I can't do it in that tech stack. I've got to do it over here. Cool. How do I buy the ability to do that? And that's kind of how I talk to people about it.
It's actually one of the subjects that we're going to deep dive into in future content for the rest of this quarter as well, is like building that business case and calculating that ROI, which is where we can really geek out and get into it all properly as well. One of the last things I wanted to pick up really before we start to think about how we wrap up now is, I guess, so you need to modernize, or you decided you want to do it. I like the fact that we've spent a bit of time talking in very generic terms, about the monolith or what it means to a cloud or everything else. I got this vision in my head of a few years back now, dealing with a client, and there was one person in there that was like, this is all rubbish, we need to rebuild it all, we should be using Ruby on Rails, we should be going doing this, And now, can you get anybody think that was a good decision at the time? How do you make sure then that you don't end up with a Betamax, that you decided you want to go and do something new? There's so many new technologies and new ideas coming out. I guess is it benefit in being that kind of early adopter? Is it more like this second time? How do they decide which is the best way to go then?
I'm first interested if anybody who listens to this has to Google what a Betamax is, but we'll move on from that for the moment. Let's assume everyone knows what one is. So this requires a couple of different dimensions. And you can still make a mistake, but I think you can reduce the chances of mistake. So the first one is, I'm not a fan of early adoption. If you think about what I do for a living and what I've done for a long time, my job is generally to solve a difficult problem. It's rare a piece of cutting edge tech that's barely been used is the right answer for that, because I'm going to need help from other people on the internet. I'm going to need tools that are available. So no, I'm definitely a fast follower rather than a cutting edge kind of person. Just because of the sorts of problems I have to solve. So I'm never going to be the person building a large language model, right? I'll be the person trying to fix it once it's busted. The first dimension after that, so after you're looking at sort of popular technologies, is in your particular area, geographical area, sector area, those kinds of concerns, what's the availability of engineers with that skill set? So I also had an engineer in my team back when I was at Electronic Arts who's a massive Rails fan, showed us all sorts of cool things that Rails can do. And it did look very cool. I wasn't against it. And actually, we were doing quite a bit of Ruby dev because one of the tools we were using needed Ruby. And yeah, it did look like a really good option at the time. But if you look at the availability of people who are doing it, if that's high, if say, in the case of Zoopla, I think something like 90% of the CVs they had seen had React on it. It's a safe bet they can hire React engineers, right? Not a big deal. So if you can get that capability, get them in. But here's the deal. It again comes back to that issue I was talking about of this decision will never be right forever. It's right for a period of time. So that's the other dimension of how long do you need it to be right for in your particular business, as best as you can forecast. What is the exploitation cycle? So once you're over your innovation hump, whatever that looks like in most organizations, that's kind of 9 to 12 months. If you're lucky, you get 15 months out of it. Okay, how long am I exploiting it for? Is it 3.5 years? Is it 5 years? What does that look like? And then you can look at this stuff and say, is this in a space where there's lots of volatility? So if 5 years ago, you'd have asked me, is React the clear winner? I'd say it is for now, but there is Vue, there is Svelte, there are other choices. So I did some CV analysis. How many people had it? Okay, everyone's got React. Fine, let's choose that. That's the safe bet in this case. That will buy us at least a few years, right? Just because of the growth of it. Now, that's where, having made that choice, you now need to be keeping an eye out for what might replace it. Either what are the React team talking about, or what are other people talking about? Because likewise, Angular is still a perfectly valid choice, right? For certain people in certain scenarios. So it's rare that there's a right or a wrong answer. It's just, well, how do I limit my chances of being wrong in the time frame where it's necessary? And that's, again, one of the things I think that CTOs aren't doing as well as they could, is plotting that timeline of making sure the board and the C-suite peers that they have are familiar with the idea that there will be a point where more investment will be needed, not just to do more of the same and bigger, but there's a point where we will need to do something extra. And the way I would ask everyone to think about it is, what happened when smartphones came out? Right? And since smartphones have come out, what have we changed? What have we done? Right? We had to, as businesses, we all had to react to the fact that there was now an expectation that everything we built had to work on a, very tiny little screen compared to a, computer monitor. And that in businesses who, Just Eat are a great example of this, by the way, where during the day, most of their orders come from PCs because people are at work ordering lunch, that kind of stuff. At night, it's all mobile because they're at home with a tablet or a phone, right? So they have to have both. They don't get to have a choice of one is better than the other. They both have to be equally good services. And fundamentally, you build mobile apps different to building web apps, right? And there's been efforts to try to align those things, but they're still very fundamentally different platforms. So the key issue here is you can only be right for a fixed period of time. And your choice as a CTO is to sit there and say, what are the choices that buy me enough time to get to the next significant investment opportunity? So where is the point where I can prepare people and set people's expectations that at this point, we are going to need to do something different? Or if they want to be one of those businesses that has a kind of continual innovation cycle so they don't go to the bust, what's the approach for that? Is there a kind of exemplar team that's kind of trying out cutting edge stuff to give it a sense and see how it's going to work? Or do they have sort of, hackathons or time in each sprint or something else where engineers can work outside of the core platform to get a sense of what's good? Again, I think Just Eat did that very well in terms of they would have hackathons, and it wasn't every hackathon, but every now and then out of a hackathon would come a significant bit of tech that made the world quite different for them, right? So however it is, that kind of stuff has to be thought of.
Cool. I'm conscious that we've obviously really focused on modernising your technology and your approach to your tech stack. Obviously, it's a much bigger topic than that, and we're going to get onto lots more over the quarter as we go through more content. Just before I wrap up, is there any other thoughts, anything you want to share, any recommendations, or how would you wrap it up for people then?
So what I would say is that the tool chain, the number of tools, the number of things that exist to help you is overwhelming. It's crazy, right? And particularly if you're a senior person, and you spend at least half your time in budget meetings and hiring meetings and everything else, it's really difficult to get to the sense of this stuff. One of the recommendations that I make almost universally now is to invest in a principal engineer. Have somebody operating outside of the teams, ideally reporting directly to the CTO or to some other senior person who is senior enough that they've been around the ring a little bit, still contributing code on at least a weekly basis, still in there, to help pull those insights out of the team, to help tell you, this ain't right, boss. Testing's taking too long, the pipeline is janky, the code itself is full of dependencies and there's a risk here that's going to bite us. That for me is the single thing. I don't think the CTO role can be completely performed by an individual. I think it's a team sport. And I think there needs to be, directors and heads of and those sorts of roles to help with running and organizing and setting strategy. But there also needs to be that direct line of, here's what's happening in tech. Here's what we're doing. And again, I know I keep mentioning AI on the aside, and I'm sure we'll do one of these podcasts more on AI, but one of the great examples is, do you let interview candidates use AI in their interview? Well, I think if you just take a CTO's perception, it will be different than if you ask a principal engineer. And I think that's an important thing. So that's how one of the pieces of advice I give to anyone listening to this is, if you are in a position where you have a mature tech stack, your company's working, everything's looking good, and you're giving half a thought to, when might that come when we have to make a significant change or a significant investment or we need to modernize, make sure you have that direct line of somebody who is skilled, experienced, can talk, and actually talk about problems, not just solutions all the time, so that you can get a better view of what's actually going on the ground with the software engineers.
Thank you, Grant, today for sharing all your knowledge and experience in the area. We will continue to focus on this theme of modernisation throughout Q1 this quarter. And if you're listening to this, do please get in touch if there's anything particular you think you'd like us to discuss on the subject. We will also be hosting a webinar later this quarter with guest panelists exploring the cost of failing to modernise and what that can mean for your business. and we'll be publishing an ebook on how to create that successful modernisation strategy. More details to come on these in the next few episodes too. Next time, I'm going to be joined by Anik, who will be discussing roles and responsibilities as you modernise your organisation. So don't forget to follow us on Spotify, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you very much. Bye. Thanks, Brad.
Thank you.